once again, I can say the most popular governor in America, Charlie Baker.
So good morning, everybody, and thanks very much for being here. You know, Desi Linden, one of the other stories about her that is worth pointing out is she won the race this year, but several years ago, she's run it several times, and several years ago, she was leading, coming around that final corner and heading down Boylston Street, and within 50 yards of the finish line, she got passed, and she lost the race by 2 seconds. And she has finished second or third or fourth in a whole bunch of these races over the course of the past 7 or 8 years. And I think there's a story there about determination, perseverance, and soldiering on that comes with her story. It's great that she won. It's great that she's the first American to win since 1985, but the most important and impressive thing to me about it is this is somebody who's come very close many times to actually grabbing the brass ring, and she didn't get discouraged, and she stuck with it, and she stayed with it. And I think in many ways that's a pretty good metaphor for dealing with data and technology in the 21st century. We live in interesting times when it comes to this stuff because there are tremendous opportunities and possibilities that are associated with what can be done with data and information and technology. But with those come a tremendous amount of limitations and curveballs and unanticipated consequences along the way. And we've talked a lot about some of this over the course of the past few years, and I want to thank Tom and his team for making this such a priority for his organization and by definition and extension everybody else. It's no secret that as the world has become more and more connected, that creates possibility and opportunity. It's also no secret that as the world becomes more and more connected, it creates more and more opportunity for mischief and disruption and ransomware and a whole bunch of other things. And I think in some respects, that's going to kind of be just a fact of life for everybody going forward, whether you're in the public sector, the private sector, or just an individual citizen. And anybody who spends any time following any of this in the news knows that at some point in some place, somewhere in the world, almost every day, there are stories associated with security and lack thereof, and we now have a very different kind of game. And I talked about this with you all over at the Fed a couple years ago, where I said the whole movement with respect to cyber attacks and hacking generally has moved from being something that was being done by a lot of people who were sort of, I wouldn't call them hobbyists because they were really smart and they knew what they were doing and they were focused on what they were up to, but it's become a state-sponsored approach to disruption and terror and a whole bunch of other things. And as we have become more and more connected, this has only become more so. And probably the most recent public example of this has been the congressional hearings and the testimony around Facebook. And what that platform, because of its size and its significance, can be used for in both a positive and a negative way. And I think for us, one of the first things we chose to do to address this was to file an Article 87 and create an executive office of technology, services, and security, and to create what I would describe as sort of one point of accountability in state government on the executive side for dealing with and incorporating a set of strategies that would be applied across the executive branch with respect to how we handled security and how we handled many of the second and third level issues that come with that. And the good news on that is the legislature was incredibly collaborative and cooperative. They got it with respect to the fact that it probably made sense for Massachusetts to create a single point of access and sort of one point of accountability with respect to security. And they moved pretty fast on that initiative and have been pretty supportive of the efforts that have been made by Mark Nunnally and his team to chase these issues and to chase them down over the course of the past 2 years. I would argue this is, a play that has more than one act, probably many, and it's going to have to continue to adjust and respond to the constantly changing nature of where the attacks come from and how they're organized and how they work. And one of the things we've tried to do is to bring together a lot of the folks from the user community. We did this over at Harvard Business School last fall, from the private sector, from the federal government, from state government, from local government, from the military, sort of all the various folks on the user side to talk about the different ways that, and the different experiences they've had with respect to attacks. And the point behind that is the single biggest advantage the attackers have most of the time is if all the folks that are being attacked aren't talking to each other and don't know what the folks who are out there poking and prodding are up to, it makes it much easier for the people who are seeking to cause disruption to succeed. Because the smarter we get by sharing information around what we see and how we're being attacked and all the rest with other people, and the more they share that with us, the smarter we get and the faster we get smart about what the latest and greatest approaches to making us all miserable might be and where they're coming from and how people are going about addressing that. And there's certainly an economic benefit to the Commonwealth in this. We have probably the third most robust cybersecurity community you're going to find anywhere in the world. And I think it gives us a tremendous edge with respect to having access to so much talent and so many folks who are thinking about this stuff all the time and building products and capabilities to support their customers. And that creates for us kind of a unique opportunity, and I know people have pursued this, to engage in discussions with some of the real-world leaders in how to think about defense and how to think about protection and how to make sure that people are thinking not just about the technologies, but the strategies and the deployment of those strategies as they go about developing their own approaches to dealing with this. Now, that's kind of the dark side of all this stuff. The bright side is the opportunity to be smarter and better about how we serve one another and how we serve the people of the Commonwealth that we seek to serve every day. And I'll give you just a couple of examples of how I think this interconnectedness and this access to data is really important when you think about the work we do and the possibilities and the opportunities that it creates for us to both think differently and be better. When people think about crime rates in the United States, one of the things they talk about a lot is the way law enforcement has used data to get out of the business of just responding and reacting to incidents and to start creating data sets that track patterns and then using those patterns to figure out where they need to be to prevent something from happening in the first place. And the best and most progressive police departments in the country, almost all of them will say that one of the things that's made the biggest difference with respect to their ability to do their job and to do it well has been the ability to use data to do pattern analysis and then use that pattern analysis to figure out where their hotspots are, what days, what times, what places, and then to basically make sure they show presence in those places. And in many cases, by simply showing presence, they reduce the amount of conflict and the series of incidents that occur there. And that was, in many respects, something that started maybe 5 or 8 years ago and has really developed a lot of speed. And if you talk to almost anybody in any major city to police department at this point, they'll tell you that a huge part of the decision-making that they make is based on predictive analytics. And if you go back 10 years or 15 years and you'd use the word predictive analytics in a police department, I mean, nobody would have had any idea what you were talking about or would have thought that would ever made any sense at all. But the capability of data and information with mapping to create really interesting pattern predictive analytics for those folks has really been a game changer with respect to their ability to do their job and to do it well. And you now have a lot of places around the country where arrests and crime are both going down at the same time, which is really unusual and something that if you'd said 10 years ago could become, in fact, the norm in many communities. People have said that's not possible. But a lot of that has to do with the use of data and information in a very unusual and different way to create a far more effective approach to how they do their work. I'll give you two other examples. If you go back about 15 years, this is what happens when you get older. Nothing really seems to have been 3 or 4 years ago. It all seems to have been a lot longer than that. Hospitals, and especially hospitals around here, but hospitals all over the place, were having a hard time managing their ERs. And it wasn't that unusual for a lot of hospitals to end up on what was called diversion. And diversion meant that you no longer had any room in your ER and that you could no longer accept any more ambulances, and somebody had to send their ambulances someplace else. And while that sounds like an inconvenience, it's actually much more than that, because hospital ERs, for the most part, are tiered. You know, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and depending upon how they're tiered, that defines what level of capability they have to deal with certain kinds of situations and circumstances that may present at their front door. And you really don't want tier 1 ERs to ever go on diversion because of the possibility that someone who needs to be at a tier 1 ER will end up at a tier 2 or a tier 3. And this was a real problem and a real conundrum, and people were struggling mightily with how to solve this. And a whole series of analysts started doing analysis around patterns. And the patterns they were pursuing was the collision between what goes on in surgical suites and what's coming into the ER. And what they learned was, because a lot of the stuff that starts in the ER eventually lands in the surgical suites and created a collision between the two. And that's when the ER started to back up, because you'd start putting people in the hallway and you couldn't actually get them into the surgical suites to get the surgery done on them to then move them to an open bed in the hospital. So they started doing this analysis, and they figured out that you could pretty much pattern the up and down of the volume inside an ER, right? So that was step number one. There were real patterns here: weekly, monthly, quarterly, even hourly in some cases. And they tracked pretty consistent over time. And then they started looking at the surgery stuff. And about half the surgeries were, in fact, emergencies of one type or another. So a bunch of them came in through the ERs, but a bunch of them also came in through other means, referrals from other hospitals and other places. But the other half of the surgeries were scheduled. And they were being scheduled in a way, in many cases, that collided directly with what was coming out of the ERs at peak periods. So a couple of hospitals said, well, what would happen if we rescheduled our surgeries on the ones we can schedule so that they land in the surgical suites during the down periods when stuff comes into the ERs? And like magic, all of a sudden, diversion went down. The other thing that happened is staff satisfaction and staff comfort about their ability to actually manage the intersection between what was coming through other doors of the hospital and what was coming through the doors of the ER got easier and better. I don't know if there's data about whether or not it reduced errors. I would imagine that it did, because you didn't have that same collision, and it certainly had a positive impact on burnout and a few other things like that. And eventually it became adopted as sort of standard practice after some of the folks who were the first movers did it. And as a result, you just don't see a lot of hospitals, ERs on diversion anymore. It's not like people built a whole bunch of new ERs. They didn't. And it's not like people suddenly got dramatically healthier than they used to be. That didn't happen either. What happened was people used data, found patterns in the data, and then applied those patterns and that data to thinking differently about how to organize what they were doing. There are so many different opportunities to do interesting things with information. The challenge is always going to be the same. Figuring out which parts and which pieces of information are actually relevant and matter, and how they fit into whatever your existing business process is in a way that can translate into a meaningful change in how things work. And in the rearview mirror, whenever most people look at this, they always go, well, of course. That was so obvious. It's not usually that obvious on the front end. When people are fishing and trying to figure out where the opportunity is and what the possibility is and where the pony is, right, inside the pile. Now, we use data in many cases to determine what happened, right? We use data in many cases to determine why something happened. The next level is to try to use data to figure out what will happen, right? And that's where the predictive analytics made a really big difference for many folks in law enforcement. And other people have used predictive analytics for all kinds of things. And then the other is, how can we actually change the future based on the data that we have so that what was happening that was not helpful doesn't happen again, can be reduced or eliminated? And the challenge for all of us, particularly in the digital age we live in, and the limited time everybody's got, is trying to find those places and those spaces and those opportunities where possibility exists, right? And I'm a big believer in 4 boxes. I'm sure, if I haven't talked to you guys about 4 boxes before, you're probably the only audience in North America I haven't talked to about it. But my idea on a 4 box is pretty simple, right? Everything in life is a 4 box. Low, high, high, low. You with me? This one is impact. Low impact, high impact. This one is degree of difficulty associated with pulling it off, high and low, right? What you don't want to do is spend a lot of time on things that land here, which would be really difficult, not much impact. That may sound pretty simple, but I'll tell you, a lot of people jump into a lot of projects having never thought about this question before they do it until they've been in it for 6 months. They suddenly realize, man, this is hard, and even if we figure it out, we're not going to get much for it. This one, high impact, low degree of difficulty, this is like all day long. The problem, of course, is finding these ones, because they're like 4-leaf clovers. The other two, low impact, low degree of difficulty, might be worth doing, might not be. Maybe the kind of thing you do someday when you got a few hours and nothing else is going on. And then this one, which is high degree of difficulty, high impact, this is probably where some of the most important opportunities will rest, because there's more of these usually than there are of these. Excuse me, these. High impact, low degree of difficulty. But the point here is that's really going to be, I think, for all of us, the big challenge on some of this. And there are things we can do to deal with some of this, to take some of the degree of difficulty down. And I'll give you sort of the best and simplest example I can think of, which is figuring out what the rules of the road will be for activities that involve multiple agencies or secretariats. Now, no joke, I worked in state government back in the 90s, and back in the 90s, we were struggling with this whole issue about whose data belonged to who for what purpose. It's kind of been an internal parlor game inside government for as long as I can remember. And it still is. But one of the things I'm hoping that some of the folks that are working on the data analytics working group will be able to help us figure out, and that's a multi-agency, interagency council, it's got most people represented, is what are the possible ways for us to think about data sharing that at least get at sort of 75% of the back and forth around what you can share and what you can't, and under what circumstances and for what purpose. Because in many cases, the technology answers are actually there, and the business opportunity is there, and people understand what folks are trying to accomplish. Where they get tangled up and ultimately, in some cases, defeated, is when they try and figure out some of the issues around the legal questions and the confidentiality issues. And I'm not a lawyer, but it does feel to me in many cases that the lawyers use the law in a very odd and sometimes inappropriate way to just avoid doing something that they don't want to do. No offense meant to the lawyers in the room. Or they could be acting as an agent for an agency head who simply doesn't want to share data with anybody for any purpose under any circumstance. We miss opportunities when people think about this stuff that way. We did a pretty significant report on opioids as part of a Chapter 55 requirement. There are 9 agencies worth of data involved in putting that report together. And when that report came out, it raised a lot of eyebrows because it told people things that in many cases were the exact opposite of what people had come to believe based on the available data that was in the marketplace up until that point in time. And in addition to that, it told people things that changed their perspective and their point of view about certain issues around policy with respect to how you deal with the prevention, education, treatment, and recovery issues associated with this horrible epidemic. It took a long time to get all 9 of those agencies to agree on what was shareable and what wasn't. And like many of these initiatives, it was a total one-off. It was a good one-off. It's a Chapter 55 report. We're going to have to do it on a regular basis anyway. And we now have kind of the framework in place that we can keep running this thing when we need to. But that's a really hard way to think about data sharing over time, and to think about how to create a framework where we recognize and understand that information can be our best friend in terms of how we do our work, how we think about the problems we're trying to solve, and what the solutions to the problems we're trying to solve might look like. Now, I know you folks are going to talk about AI today. I think of AI as kind of the problem-solving exercise that I just put in the 4-box on steroids, super steroids. And I think it absolutely has possibility and potential when it comes to government and state government. But I think there's a whole bunch of building blocks that are much more mundane around some of the stuff that I've been talking about that we're going to have to wrestle our way through before we get to the point where AI is going to do the sort of thing for us that some of its biggest supporters would tell you it can do. And the way I think about AI is kind of the way I think about the internet. In the mid-90s and the late 90s, everybody said the internet was going to change everything. And they said it was going to change everything by like 2001. So what ended up happening was the internet showed up, boom, splash, oh my God, look at this, it's the internet. But by 2001, it really hadn't changed that many things at all. And so people went, well, all those people who are out there cheerleading for this thing were wrong. The internet doesn't change everything. It's not going to change everything. It hasn't changed everything, and it certainly hasn't changed in the time frame people said it would. Some guy around that period of time wrote a paper that was called the rise and fall and the rise of the internet. And his point was, everybody thought it was going to go like this. It didn't. Kind of went like this, and then it went like that. Remember how everybody thought every brick and mortar company was going to go out of business, and the only companies that would be there would be internet companies, and people put billions and billions of dollars, trillions of dollars into internet companies thinking they were going to be the solutions. And a lot of these companies were actually buying Super Bowl ads when they had no revenue and no customers and all the rest. But again, you have to be old, as I am, to remember some of this. But the guy was right. The internet had this big, huge, it's going to be great. It didn't turn out to be quite as great as everybody thought it was, and kind of like this. But the underlying opportunity associated with it, as people tinkered with it and dealt with that 4-box that I'm talking about, eventually it started to go like this again. And here we are today, where we think about it as having been a profound disruptor that's changed the game in a lot of ways. But I would argue most of the ways it's changed the game are not the ways that people thought it was going to change the game back in the 90s. Because it took a while for everybody to figure out, and I don't mean like a month or 2 months or a year. I mean in some cases like 5 years to 10 years, to really figure out what it was it could do, how it would do it, and why it would matter and make a difference. And I think AI is going to be kind of like that too. There's so many issues that have to get sort of addressed and resolved with respect to what data matters. How do you create consistency and comfort around how people share data and information? And how does that AI machine actually start to translate data into something you can actually use to make a decision? That kind of stuff's going to take a while. But in the meantime, there are many, many opportunities for state governments to take advantage of the amount of information that people have, the amount of data that they have, and try to think about how to use it strategically to improve the way we serve the various communities that we're all part of. And I think for the Commonwealth, the big challenge in this is going to be one of sort of mindset and time. And I really do appreciate the fact that Mark Nunnally and the folks have created this data analytics working group, which, by the way, is DAWG. And for those of you who paid any attention to the Patriots draft over the weekend, you know they took 4 guys from the University of Georgia, which happens to be the Dogs, DAWG. I'm going somewhere with this. And where I was going with it is nobody's better at using data to make smart decisions than the Patriots. I mean, that has really been their hallmark with respect to how they've done their work. And I think having an interagency group that actually spends a lot of time bringing the best minds across the executive branch together in a formal, structured way to think about how data analytics can improve what we do will, over time, if people stick with it, translate into some really interesting ideas about how to see things in a way we don't see them now, and to make adjustments to the way we operate and perform to improve the quality of the work that we perform every day. And when somebody says, well, like what? I go back to the answer about how the internet evolved. You know, most of the time, those are really hard things to predict. People need to actually start to get comfortable with it and feel it and think about it. And whoever it was that first started screwing around with predictive analytics and law enforcement was way out there compared to where the rest of the community was. And it was only after it started to demonstrate having real impact that other people sort of, you know, most of this stuff, right? It's usually first movers, fast followers, and then everybody else. And I think in this data analytics space, that's going to be the same sort of thing, which is you're going to have some folks who represent what I would describe as the first movers. You're going to have folks who are then going to be the fast followers. But the possibilities and the opportunities here are big. And I absolutely believe that if we stay with it, back to our friend up here, who ran a whole bunch of marathons in which she finished 2nd, 4th, 8th, and 10th, but she stayed with it until she finished first. There's real opportunity here for us to provide people with a far more effective state government than we would otherwise be capable of delivering on, because it is a way for us to get much smarter about how we do what we do. And the challenge for us is getting comfortable with the idea that it's okay to share information, getting comfortable with the idea that we can do that in a secure way, and getting comfortable with the idea that maybe even if we've been around for 10 or 15 or 20 years, we may not know everything there is to know based on our existing assumptions about how things work and where the possible opportunities to improve them are going to rest. Because some of this is going to surprise people, and it'll surprise them in a positive way. And that's why it's great that you're here. It's great that Tom is doing this for the 3rd time. And I think for all of us, there's lots of challenge in this because of the world we live in. But with it is just enormous opportunity to think differently about a lot of things. And I hope we all embrace that and draw our 4 boxes and figure out where our biggest and best opportunities to be successful at it are. Thank you.